It began with a mistake. Not sabotage, not heroism, just one tired American pilot lost above a grey German morning, November 1943. The air war over Europe had entered its cruel middle age. Skies thick with flak, bombers crawling toward the Ruhr, fighters dueling in the thin blue miles above. Lieutenant William Roach of the 350th Fighter Group was flying escort that day, strapped into his brand-new P-47 Thunderbolt. They called her Beetle, rugged, heavy, and loud, a flying anvil that could dive faster than anything with wings. Somewhere between cloud banks and chaos, Roach lost his bearings. Fuel ran low. Radio silence hung thick. The compass danced wildly from magnetic interference. In his headset crackled nothing but static and fear. He spotted a strip of tarmac below, wide, clean, and mercifully empty. Relief flooded through him. He eased the throttle, flaps down, wheels out, heart pounding. Only when he rolled to a stop did he see the Black Cross insignia on the hangar doors. Roach had landed in enemy territory. Within minutes, armed guards surrounded the Thunderbolt. The young lieutenant was pulled from the cockpit, hands trembling more from disbelief than terror. He had delivered to the Luftwaffe what Allied intelligence could never have risked losing: a fully intact, combat-ready P-47D. At Rechlin Test Center, Germany's secret crucible for aircraft evaluation, news of the capture spread like wildfire. Engineers and officers gathered around photographs of the American machine, muttering half-mocking remarks. Primitive construction, too heavy for serious combat, typical American excess. They laughed, but beneath the chuckles was unease. Even the best German test pilots wanted a look. Among them was Hauptmann Hans-Werner Lerche, a quiet, methodical man known for flying everything from Spitfires to Yaks to Lightnings. His reputation at Rechlin was unusual, brutally honest, but loyal enough to survive. Honesty in a regime allergic to it. When an order came down, fly the captured Thunderbolt, evaluate, he didn't hesitate. He requested a full inspection, demanded the fuel specifications, and, characteristically, made sure his parachute straps were double-checked. They repainted the aircraft with German markings, black crosses over olive drab, the code T9+FK on the fuselage. Beetle was now property of the Luftwaffe. The morning of the flight, November 10, 1943, was clear and cold. Rechlin's runways stretched into mist, the hangars echoing with distant hammering. Lerche approached the Thunderbolt slowly, taking notes like a surgeon examining a patient. It looked ungainly beside the sleek BF 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds parked nearby, bulky fuselage, oversized propeller, exhaust pipes snaking like veins. The radial engine, a Pratt & Whitney R2800, was a beast of metal cylinders and bolts. To German eyes, it resembled tractor machinery more than precision engineering. But Lerche saw something else. The panel fit was coarse, yes, but uniform. The screws were identical, easy to reach. The cowlings removed in minutes, not hours. The cockpit canopy slid open smoothly with one hand. The undercarriage, wide-set and strong, looked capable of absorbing punishment that would shatter the delicate, spindly gear of a 109. He muttered to the ground crew, "Praktisch nicht hübsch." Practical, not pretty. Inside, he settled into the cockpit. His knees didn't jam the panel. He could see forward over the long nose, not perfectly, but enough. Switches were grouped, labeled, color-coded. Red for danger, yellow for caution, blue for fuel, green for normal operation. German aircraft demanded memory. American aircraft invited intuition. He paused, noting the leather seat cushion, the heating vents, even the placement of the oxygen hose. For long flights, he realized, they expect their pilots to sit here for hours. When the mechanics signaled clear, Lerche fired the engine. The R-2800 coughed, then roared alive with a deep, throaty vibration unlike anything German. The entire airframe trembled, but the gauges stayed steady. Oil pressure rose quickly, temperatures held firm. It was crude, perhaps, but stable. As the propeller blurred, Lerche adjusted the throttle and felt the torque fight his rudder pedal. He smiled. So this is American horsepower. Moments later, he released the brakes. The Thunderbolt surged forward, tail lifting, tires howling. He expected sluggishness instead. The acceleration pinned him to the seat. By the end of the runway, she was climbing like a freight train with wings. At 1,000 meters, the turbocharger's whistle joined the engine's growl, a rising metallic note that sounded almost alive. Lerche tested the controls smooth, deliberate, forgiving. Not as crisp as a 109, not as nimble as a 190, but predictable. He tried stalls. She buffeted gently, wings shuddering without flipping. He tried dives. The speed built frighteningly fast, so fast he had to pull back early to avoid redlining. The Thunderbolt wanted to go down hard and come out unbroken. Above the grey lake and the pine forests, Lerche realized something quietly devastating. The Americans had designed not for beauty, nor for mastery, but for survival. And in total war, survival was strategy. After 90 minutes, he brought Beetle home. The landing was firm but safe. Mechanics rushed forward, eager for his verdict. Lerche climbed down, removed his gloves, and stared at the aircraft for a long moment before speaking. "This machine," he said softly, "is not crude. It is practical." He wrote it in his report that evening, knowing every sentence would be scrutinized. His words carried both admiration and warning. The Americans built fighters anyone could fly, maintain, and repair. Germany built machines only masters could handle, and masters were dying faster than they could be replaced. He submitted the report anyway, and by doing so, Hans-Werner Lerche committed a small, quiet act of heresy. Rechlin was not just an airfield. It was Germany's hidden mirror, a place where the truth about warplanes could be seen, but never freely spoken. Tucked beside a quiet lake north of Berlin, the Erprobungsstelle Rechlin was the Luftwaffe's sacred testing ground, part laboratory, part prison for engineers. It was here that the finest test pilots dissected both friend and foe in the search for advantage. Spitfires, Mustangs, Lightnings, Bostons, each captured specimen brought to Rechlin was stripped of its paint, its pride, and its secrets. But the truth that lived inside those hangars was dangerous. Rechlin was run by scientists, but watched by ideologues. The SS maintained presence nearby. Even the wind seemed to carry whispers of fear. Hans-Werner Lerche understood the stakes. He had been at Rechlin for years, flying almost anything with wings, Allied, Axis, prototype, or disaster. He'd tested Italian fighters that spun like tops, Soviet aircraft that rattled his bones, and French bombers that lumbered through the sky like flying barns. But the danger was never the planes. It was the reports. Write too harshly about a German design, and you defend a favored manufacturer, Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, or Junkers. Write too kindly about an enemy's aircraft, and you defend the Reich itself. And in Hitler's Germany, offense could cost a man his uniform, or worse. So every test pilot learned to speak in code, to lace praise with however, to bury criticism behind operational challenges. Rechlin's reports were symphonies of careful phrasing. The truth lived between the lines for those smart enough to read it. Lerche, however, still believed honesty mattered, at least inside these walls. He was no rebel, no hero, just a meticulous engineer with a conscience. He loved flying because, up there, politics didn't matter. Gravity treated everyone the same, Nazi, American, or Soviet. But on the ground, gravity had rules. After his first flight in the P-47, Lerche knew he was walking a fine line. The data spoke for itself. The Thunderbolt's engine was astonishingly smooth, its systems idiot-proof, its build quality consistent to a fault. The plane's so-called crudeness wasn't a flaw. It was philosophy, every bolt, every gauge, designed to serve a pilot who might have only 200 hours of experience. In the Luftwaffe, that idea bordered on heresy. Germany worshipped the individual ace, the lone hunter who mastered his machine through instinct and nerve. From Bolke to Gallen to Hauptmann, the myth of the superhuman pilot defined their air war. But in the P-47, Lerche saw the opposite, the democratization of combat. This was a machine designed to make average men effective, to multiply their power through reliability. He imagined what it meant, thousands of these practical fighters flooding the sky, flown not by the few, but by the many. It was the industrialization of air superiority, and it terrified him. That evening, Lerche walked the Rechlin hangars under dim yellow lights. The captured aircraft sat like ghosts of opposing philosophies, an American P-47 beside a German W-190. The difference almost symbolic. One brute force, round and muscular, the other sharp-edged and elegant. Two nations had reached opposite conclusions about what war demanded. Germany chased perfection, America chased production. And now, in 1943, Lerche suspected which one would win. He drafted his test report carefully, as though every adjective could draw a pistol. He wrote of the Thunderbolt's remarkably smooth engine performance, its excellent directional stability, its simplified control arrangement. He described its cockpit layout as logical, and its build quality as exceptionally robust. Then he added a final line, a quiet dagger. The Americans have not built a crude aircraft, they have built a practical one. He hesitated before typing it. He knew how it would read to the wrong eyes. Practical implied intelligence. Not crude implied equality. And equality between German and American engineering was an idea the Reich would not tolerate. Still, he left the line in. He couldn't bring himself to lie. He signed the report and placed it in the file tray, knowing full well it might vanish or resurface at the worst possible time. Outside, the winter night deepened over the lake. The sky was black, the hangars silent. Somewhere in the distance, engines roared the constant heartbeat of Rechlin's experiments. Lerche paused on the tarmac and looked up. He imagined those same engines echoing over Germany a year from now, not from Rechlin, but from endless formations of Thunderbolts. Each one piloted by some 20-year-old American who barely knew how to shave and yet could fly 8 hours straight without getting lost or killed by mechanical failure. He exhaled slowly, a trace of frost leaving his lips. Practical, he whispered again, as though testing the weight of the word. He didn't know it yet, but the small truth he'd written that day, a truth about philosophy, not horsepower, would outlast the Reich itself. The next morning, frost still clung to the airfield roofs. The sun came late to Rechlin in November, thin light stretching across the lake, illuminating the dark silhouettes of parked aircraft. And there, gleaming beneath a coat of dew, stood the captured P-47. Its olive-drab skin was streaked with handprints from the German crew who had repainted it. The bold black crosses looked almost awkward against its American curves. Lerche approached quietly, clipboard in hand. Around him, mechanics watched with curiosity, some eager, others skeptical. To them, the Thunderbolt was a puzzle wrapped in arrogance. To Lerche, it was a message in metal. He started with what the Germans always started with, the cockpit. Climbing the ladder, he eased into the seat and immediately stopped. The first sensation was space. The cockpit felt enormous. Not the tight, coffin-like enclosures of the Bf-109 or F-190, where pilots practically wore the airplane. Here, he could move his shoulders, stretch his legs. Adjust without feeling trapped. He thought of long missions over Europe, 8 hours of flight, 4 of them in freezing altitudes. Suddenly, it made sense. The Thunderbolt wasn't built for short, violent duels over the Channel. It was built for endurance. He noted this in his log. Cockpit, unusually spacious, comfortable even with full flight gear. May suggest long operational range and pilot endurance priority. Then his eyes began to move, scanning the instrument panel. It was unlike anything he'd seen in a German aircraft. The gauges were big, clear, color-coded, each one with thick white numerals and simple markings, red zones for danger, green arcs for safe operation. Fuel, oil, manifold pressure, everything was exactly where a pilot's eyes would naturally fall. There was a strange elegance in the simplicity. In German aircraft, instruments were often scattered according to engineering logic, efficient on paper, chaotic in practice. Here, the Americans had done the opposite, designed for the operator, not the designer. He smiled faintly. It's as if they built this for anyone. The throttle quadrant caught his attention next. Wide, sturdy levers with distinct shapes, easy to grip through gloves. Mixture, propeller pitch, and throttle, each designed to be adjusted by feel, not sight. Blind operation possible, he murmured, making a note. Ergonomic layout even in turbulence. Then came the color coding, something the Germans considered almost childish. Blue for fuel, red for heat, yellow for oil, green for flaps. But as Lerche studied it, he realized the brilliance behind it. In combat, when adrenaline blurred vision and blood rushed to the brain, a pilot didn't read. He recognized color and shape were faster than words, and faster meant survival. He leaned back in the seat and reached for the canopy handle. Smooth, effortless. The visibility was surprisingly good, not the wraparound glass of later models, but clear enough to see a bomber's tail or a Messerschmitt approaching from below. The tall seat and raised canopy gave a commanding view over the nose. He adjusted the gun sight, simple reflector type, bright and steady. German sights were often sharper, more sophisticated, but this one felt practical, easy to align, impossible to misread. He turned his attention to the control stick. It felt heavier than a 109's but smoother. Hydraulic assist gave the stick a resistance that was neither stiff nor loose. Balanced, he wrote, predictable. And then he noticed something the engineers hadn't mentioned, the seat armor. Behind him, a thick plate of steel curved along the backrest, bolted solidly to the frame. German fighters had armor too, but often thin or limited to critical zones. The Thunderbolt's was heavy, almost excessive. It added weight, but saved lives. Perhaps the Americans expect to take damage, he thought grimly. He pressed the starter again to test electrical systems. The engine coughed, then settled into a deep, rhythmic rumble. Even the vibration felt tamed, balanced through redundant mounts and dampers. He checked the gauges, oil steady, fuel flow consistent, manifold pressure smooth. Everything about it screamed industrial confidence. To German eyes, this was not refinement. It was over-engineering. But to Lerche, it was foresight. Every system was simplified so that a pilot, whether trained in Texas or Trenton, could operate it without killing himself. He thought of young Luftwaffe recruits barely surviving their first solo flights. They flew machines that demanded perfection. The Thunderbolt forgave imperfection. That difference, he realized, was philosophy disguised as engineering. As he powered down, a mechanic approached him, laughing. "Too big, isn't it? Must feel like flying a barn." Lerche smiled politely. "Yes," he said, "a very comfortable barn that brings its pilot home." The mechanic frowned, unsure if it was a joke. Lerche didn't explain. He simply removed his gloves and rested a hand on the Thunderbolt's cold metal skin. The aircraft didn't look elegant, but it felt alive. Every rivet told a story of factories, not artisans of thousands of identical machines, each one built not for glory, but for numbers. He scribbled one last note before leaving. Layout designed for efficiency, not artistry. Maintenance simplified. Training time reduced. Ideal for large-scale deployment. He paused, pen still in hand, then underlined two words, mass-producible. That night, in his quarters, Lerche couldn't shake the thought. He pictured German factories struggling to produce a handful of Me 109 seconds per day, while somewhere across the Atlantic, assembly lines at Republic Aviation turned out Thunderbolts by the dozens. Each one nearly identical, each one as simple to fly as it was to fix, and each one, unlike Germany's masterpieces, replaceable. He closed his notebook and exhaled. The war, he realized, wasn't just being fought in the skies. It was being fought in philosophy, and Germany had already lost that battle. The air over Rechlin that November morning was razor clear. The lake below shimmered like polished steel, the forests motionless in the cold. Hans-Werner Lerche taxied the P-47 onto the runway, gloved hands light on the throttle. The crew chief gave a thumbs up. The propeller blurred, the turbo whined, and the American brute began to move. Even before takeoff, the Thunderbolt felt different. It didn't leap off the ground like a 109. It built momentum, heavy but unstoppable. The Pratt and Whitney R-2800 roared with deep, confident power, a sound less like a fighter and more like a small locomotive. At 150 kilometers per hour, the tail lifted. At 180, the main wheels left the concrete. She didn't climb like a dancer. She climbed like a promise. At 1,000 meters, Lerche eased back the throttle and trimmed for level flight. The stick pressure was firm, deliberate, none of the twitchy sensitivity of German fighters tuned for aces. He tested a gentle turn, then a roll. The Thunderbolt responded smoothly, predictably, almost politely. He noted it aloud into his recorder. Control response steady, aircraft stable. No sudden over-control tendencies. Then he pushed the throttle forward again, the turbocharger spooling up with that high-pitched metallic scream unique to American radial engines. The pressure gauge surged. The big plane surged with it. Below 10,000 feet, the Thunderbolt was merely respectable. Above 15,000, it became something else entirely. Lerche climbed, watching the altimeter wind upward. German engines, especially the Daimler-Benz 605 seconds in the 109 seconds, gasped for air above 20,000 feet. Superchargers struggled, power faded, but the American turbocharger was a different animal. It was massive, tucked deep in the fuselage, recycling exhaust gases to maintain pressure at altitude. At 25,000 feet, the P-47's engine still felt alive, steady torque, full manifold pressure. Lerche whistled softly through his oxygen mask. He'd never seen anything like it. He made a quick note. Turbo supercharger, extremely effective, continuous power at high altitude, climb rate consistent to 8,000 meters. That was a polite way of saying the Luftwaffe had a problem. The Thunderbolt could fight and win where most German fighters could barely breathe. He leveled off and began testing handling characteristics. First, turns at combat power, left, right, steep, shallow. The plane bled energy quickly in tight turns, a trade-off for its weight, but its roll rate was superb for its size. Then came stalls. He throttled back, raised the nose. The airframe shuddered, wings buffeted, and instead of snapping into a spin, the P-47 simply dropped its nose and recovered. "Forgiving," he wrote. "Pilot error, not fatal." Next came dives. Lerche throttled back, rolled inverted, and pushed the nose down until the horizon vanished. The airspeed needle climbed, 400, 500, 600 kilometers per hour. He expected buffeting, perhaps a structural warning. Instead, the plane felt planted stable, heavy, but solid. At 700 kilometers per hour, the controls stiffened. The stick fought back, but she held together, no shudder, no flutter, just sheer momentum. He pulled gently, feeling the G-forces press him into the seat. The aircraft leveled out cleanly. He exhaled into the mask. So, that's what 8 tons of America feels like. Down low again, he checked the engine temperatures. Oil steady, cylinder head normal. No spikes, no leaks, no angry red warnings. Most German high-performance fighters ran hot after a few minutes of full power. The Thunderbolt simply endured. He performed gunnery sight calibration next, noting its simplicity. No delicate electronics, just sturdy optics and mechanical adjustment screws. He could almost imagine a line mechanic in the field, replacing one in 10 minutes. That was the theme of this plane. Fixable, replaceable, repeatable. And then came something no German fighter ever gave him peace of mind. He realized he wasn't fighting the machine. He was using it. No constant trim corrections, no overheating worries, no fear of one wrong movement leading to disaster. For the first time in years, Hans-Werner Lerche felt relaxed in an aircraft. And that, he realized, might be America's deadliest secret of all. He landed after 90 minutes in the air. The touchdown was smooth, the landing gear forgiving even on Rechlin's rough strip. He cut the throttle, the massive propeller slowing to a heavy rhythmic thud. When silence returned, he simply sat there for a moment, hands resting on the stick. The cockpit smelled of oil and warm metal, a scent that somehow felt reassuring. He opened the canopy and climbed down, surrounded instantly by officers and engineers. They fired questions. How does it climb? Is it slow to turn? Does the turbo lag? Would it survive a dogfight? Lerche answered carefully, choosing words that told the truth without inviting trouble. It's heavy, he began, but steady. You cannot outturn a Messerschmitt, but you can outdive it. Outclimb it above 6,000 meters, and you can always come home. He paused, then added quietly, It feels designed to forgive mistakes. The engineers scribbled, skeptical. One of them laughed. So it is a flying tractor, eh? Lerche didn't smile. Maybe, he said, but a tractor can plow a field long after a racehorse breaks its leg. That evening, in his flight log, he summarized his impressions. General handling, predictable. Engine reliability, exceptional. Dive performance, outstanding structure solid beyond expectation. Stall behavior, benign. Combat potential, high at altitude. Summary, a machine designed not for experts, but for survival. He underlined that final phrase twice. It wasn't praise, it was prophecy, because Lerche knew that wars weren't won by perfection. They were won by machines that worked every day, for every man, under every condition. And on that November day in 1943, he had just flown proof that America understood the truth far better than Germany ever would. For all its speed, altitude, and power, what truly haunted Hans-Werner Lerche wasn't how the P-47 flew, but how it refused to die. In the weeks that followed his first test flight, he began a deeper series of evaluations, ground runs, engine overboost trials, simulated combat damage. Every test seemed to end the same way, with the Thunderbolt still running, still flying, still coming home. At Rechlin, they liked to test a captured plane until it broke. That was the rule. They'd stress the wings, run engines at full throttle until seals melted, or fire small-caliber rounds into the fuselage to observe behavior under damage. But the P-47 didn't cooperate. It wouldn't fail. On one test day, Lerche ordered a partial power loss simulation, the kind that would normally ground a 109 or FOE 190. The mechanics disconnected a magneto, intentionally reduced fuel pressure, and even blocked one oil line. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 coughed once, then stabilized, rumbling along at 70% output as if nothing had happened. Temperatures rose, but stayed within limits. Oil pressure dropped, but didn't collapse. Lerche leaned over the panel, watching in disbelief. "It runs with one lung gone," he said softly. Like a man refusing to fall. He noted how the redundant systems, dual magnetos, multiple fuel pumps, separate oil circuits, turned catastrophe into inconvenience. It was as if the Americans had designed their engines for soldiers, not for scientists. Later, he tested the airframe's strength. He ordered ground crews to study every connection point, wing spars, fuselage stringers, armor plates. The Thunderbolt's internal structure was thick, heavy, almost excessive by German standards. One Focke-Wulf engineer mocked it. "Wasteful. Look how much aluminum they've buried in this flying tank." "Inefficient," Lerche nodded, then quietly replied. "Maybe inefficient, but efficient at staying alive." He pointed to the thick frames, to the radial engine that doubled as armor. Unlike the liquid-cooled Daimler-Benz engines that could be punctured by a single bullet, the P-47's massive radial could keep spinning even with entire cylinders shot away. A single hit to a 109's radiator meant an engine seizure within minutes. A hit to the Thunderbolt cylinder row meant nothing. It kept flying. He began collecting American combat reports, those few that intelligence managed to intercept. They told stories that sounded like propaganda, but they were real. A P-47 limped home across the channel with half its elevator shot off. Another returned with 200 holes in its fuselage. One pilot crash-landed with a dead engine, fuel lines torn, and yet the airframe remained intact enough to walk away. To the Germans, this was madness. To Lerche, it was mathematics. If every third German fighter was lost to damage, and every third American fighter survived damage, then even before production was counted, the Luftwaffe was losing the war of probability. He wrote a separate confidential note, one he never filed officially, comparing American and German design philosophy in combat durability. German design, minimal weight, maximum performance, narrow safety margins. American design, maximum reliability, maximum redundancy, broad margins. Consequence, German machines superior until something fails. American machines inferior until something fails, then superior. It was the kind of observation that could ruin a career, so he kept it hidden. One afternoon, a visiting general from Berlin came to observe. The man had read Lerche's preliminary findings and was displeased. He pointed at the P-47's frame and laughed. "Do you call this craftsmanship? It is clumsy, ugly. A refrigerator with wings." Lerche looked him in the eye and said carefully, "Perhaps, but one refrigerator can take a bullet and another cannot." The general frowned. "We don't build for peasants, Hauptmann. We build for the ploughed. Best pilots in the world." Lerche said nothing. But in his mind he saw Germany's shrinking squadrons, veteran aces, replaced by exhausted boys, barely trained, thrown into the sky against endless waves of sturdy American fighters. He knew the truth the general refused to see. The Luftwaffe was still building for a past that no longer existed. Weeks later, Lerche took Beetle up again to test landing resilience. He deliberately came in heavy, too fast, simulating a wounded return. The aircraft bounced, jolted and settled safely. The struts held. The gear didn't collapse. He imagined a tired American pilot in Italy or England, returning from escort duty with a smoking engine, maybe wounded, maybe dizzy, yet still able to bring his aircraft home alive. That wasn't luck. That was design. It dawned on him then that this was the essence of American air power. Theirs was not a race for perfection, but a race for persistence. To fight, survive, repair, and fight again. He recorded a final note in his flight log. The P-47 embodies industrial confidence. A machine built not for an individual ace, but for an endless line of pilots who may not be aces at all. And yet they will win. He paused, staring at those words, then added one last line in his neat handwriting. Durability is strategy. That phrase would echo in his head for years, long after the war ended, long after Rechlin was rubble and Germany's skies belonged to others. Because on that cold test day in 1943, Hans-Werner Lerche realized that engineering was not ideology. It was truth. And the Thunderbolt, in all its noisy, overweight glory, was a machine built not to impress, but to endure. And in total war, endurance is what wins. In the weeks after his flight tests, Hans-Werner Lerche's technical notes made their way up the chain and then vanished into silence. No official acknowledgement, no response from Berlin. Just a quiet disappearance into the labyrinth of Luftwaffe bureaucracy where inconvenient truths went to die. Lerche suspected why. His report didn't praise German superiority, it questioned it. And in 1943, questioning the Reich faith in its own perfection was an act of quiet rebellion. For years, German engineers had treated design as art machines crafted for virtuosos, not ordinary men. The Messerschmitt 109 was one such masterpiece. Agile, elegant, lethal in skilled hands. But it was also fragile, temperamental, and deadly to novices. The Focke-Wulf 190 pushed the limits of aerodynamics, but each one required days of maintenance and constant tuning to remain battle-ready. The Me-262 jet promised salvation, but it consumed resources faster than the nation could supply them. They were all extraordinary machines. But extraordinary machines belong in museums, not wars of attrition. The Americans, Lerche realized, had built something far more dangerous. Ordinary excellence. The Thunderbolt was not a genius's machine, it was a soldier's tool. It could be repaired with a wrench instead of a blueprint. It could fly through mud, rain, or hail without needing a prayer. It didn't demand brilliance, it delivered consistency. And consistency, Lerche knew, is what wins wars. He began to see the larger pattern. In Germany, the pilot was hero and myth, the lone knight of the air. In America, the pilot was worker and cog, one among thousands, interchangeable yet effective. It wasn't romantic, it was terrifying. Because when a German ace died, experience died with him. When an American pilot died, another took his place, trained on a simulator, flying a familiar machine, reading the same color-coded gauges, trusting the same forgiving controls. Each P-47 was a copy of the last, each pilot a reflection of the one before. The system didn't mourn its losses, it absorbed them. That was the secret Lerche's superiors didn't want to hear. Germany built fighters for aces, America built fighters for armies. He wrote that sentence in his private notebook, not in any official report, not even coded. Just the truth, scratched in pencil. Germany builds for performance, America builds for purpose. The first wins duels. The second wins wars. That night, he sat alone in his quarters, staring at the lake outside Rechlin. A layer of ice was forming along the shore, fragile, temporary. He thought of his country's obsession with being the best, even as it starved itself doing so. He had tested Soviet aircraft that looked crude but kept flying. He had flown British planes that felt balanced and clever. But nothing unnerved him like this American Thunderbolt, because it revealed what Germany had refused to understand since 1939. This war was not about the brilliance of the few, it was about the endurance of the many. Weeks later, Lerche attended a briefing at which high-ranking Luftwaffe officers reviewed enemy equipment, charts, graphs, tables, endless claims of superiority. The Me-109 outclimbed the P-47 below 10,000 feet. The F-190 turned tighter in dogfights. German guns hit harder. German pilots scored more kills. The generals nodded in agreement, reinforcing each other's illusions. When Lerche was asked to speak, he hesitated. He could feel the room waiting, expecting validation. He cleared his throat. "The Thunderbolt," he began carefully, "is not elegant, it is not efficient, it is not refined, but it works. It works in all weather, with all pilots, in all conditions. And that, gentlemen, is the future." Silence. Then an officer scoffed. "You mean the future belongs to overweight tractors?" Lerche allowed himself a half-smile. "Perhaps, but they will be tractors that never stop." The laughter was uneasy this time. He left the meeting with a heavy certainty. The Luftwaffe was trapped in its own mythology. The German obsession with elite skill had become a cage. Every new design was faster, sharper, thinner-skinned, the physical embodiment of a nation chasing an image of invincibility. But America was chasing something different: availability. A concept few at Rechlin even discussed. The percentage of planes that could take off each morning, not how beautifully they flew once airborne. Lerche ran the numbers quietly one night. In 1943, the Luftwaffe's operational readiness hovered around 50%. The Thunderbolt groups in England, 85 to 90. It wasn't a matter of courage, it was math. And math, not pride, decides wars. He kept flying the P-47 when he could more out of curiosity than duty. Each time he did, he found himself trusting it more, even liking it. It was an honest aircraft, no hidden vices, no surprises. You could make mistakes in it and live to learn from them. It was, in a strange way, humane. Sometimes he wondered if that was the greatest difference of all. Germany had built machines that demanded perfection from imperfect men. America had built machines that accepted imperfection and still delivered victory. In his final report on Beetle, Lerche wrote one last line before signing his name. He knew no one would quote it. But history would prove him right. The Thunderbolt is not designed to win a duel. It is designed to make sure the pilot fights again tomorrow. He underlined tomorrow. Because by 1943, even he could feel that Germany was running out of tomorrows. By early 1944, the truth Hans-Werner Lerche had written in secret was no longer theoretical. It was visible in the sky, everywhere. From Normandy to the Ruhr, the hum of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 became the new sound of inevitability. Thousands of Thunderbolt's P-47 seconds filled the European horizon, their silver bodies glinting in sunlight, their turbos screaming like angry hornets. They escorted B-17 seconds deep into Germany, swept the Luftwaffe from the air, and shredded supply lines on the ground. By mid-year, the tractor Lerche had flown at Rechlin had become the most feared machine over Europe. At first, German aces mocked them. Too big, too heavy, too American. But as the months passed, mockery turned into silence. The P-47 seconds could take punishment that would obliterate a 109. They dove faster than anything in the Luftwaffe's inventory. And worst of all, there were always more. Every week, new squadrons arrived in England and Italy. Every month, new replacement aircraft. Every pilot who fell was replaced before the smoke cleared. The Luftwaffe could win battles, but it couldn't win math. By spring 1944, Germany's air defense had become a losing game of attrition. Factories bombed, fuel supplies collapsing, airfields cratered. Lerche's beloved Rechlin itself was hit by Allied raids, its runways torn and hangars gutted. And still the Thunderbolts came. He would later write in his memoir, with quiet resignation, "We had reached a point where fighting skill could not compensate for absence of machines, fuel, and men. Our technical brilliance had nowhere to go." The Luftwaffe, once the envy of the world, was now flying skeleton crews. Even the elite test pilots were ordered into combat squadrons. By the summer of 1944, Lerche himself was grounded not by injury or discipline, but by futility. There was nothing left to test. The Reich was dying. He reread his old P-47 notes one night in those final months. The pages were yellowed from engine oil and damp air. His own handwriting stared back at him like prophecy. Germany builds for aces, America builds for armies. He had not meant it poetically, he had meant it as an engineer. But now, as P-47 seconds roared overhead on their way to Berlin, it read like an epitaph. He thought back to that first flight, the moment the Thunderbolt had lifted from Rechlin's runway with effortless steadiness, its massive engine growling with confidence. He remembered the sound, the smell, the weight of it. And he realized that what he'd flown that day wasn't just an airplane. It was an idea, an industrial philosophy with wings. In 1945, as Allied troops swept across northern Germany, Lerche surrendered to the British. He expected interrogation, perhaps even punishment. Instead, they treated him with respect. To his surprise, they already knew his name. Rechlin's test pilot, one officer said. The one who flew everything. When the Americans asked what he thought of their aircraft, Lerche gave them the same quiet truth he had once risked everything to write. The Thunderbolt was not graceful, but it was right. The interrogator chuckled. Right? Yes, Lerche said. Right in purpose, right in philosophy. It was not built to impress, it was built to endure. The officer nodded slowly. You understood that before most of us did. After the war, Lerche worked briefly with Allied evaluation teams, helping catalogue captured German technology. Ironically, many of the innovations he once tested for the Luftwaffe now belonged to the victors. Germany had built the world's fastest, most advanced aircraft jets, rockets, guided bombs, but none had arrived in time, nor in numbers that mattered. The Americans and British, by contrast, had built enough. Quantity, sustained by reliability, had crushed genius. The P-47's descendants would fly long after the Reich fell in Korea, in South America, in countless air forces across the world. Its reputation endured not as the prettiest or most agile fighter, but as the one that always came home. And in every design that followed, from the F-84 to the F-86, you could trace echoes of the same philosophy. Make it tough, make it fixable, make it last. Lerche returned to his civilian life quietly, writing his memoir years later. He spoke little about ideology, but often about design. He wrote that engineers should build not for glory, but for function. Not for the hero, but for the human. One line from his final chapter stands out even today. A machine that forgives the man who flies, it is the highest form of engineering. It was as if he was still talking about that big, loud, indestructible P-47. By 1945, Germany's skies were filled not with aces, but with smoke. And above it all, the Thunderbolts thundered on heavy, practical, unsentimental, and unstoppable. Lerche had seen the future in that cockpit 2 years earlier. He'd even written it down. But his country hadn't wanted the truth. And so, the truth had arrived anyway, with 8,000 horsepower, 8 tons of metal, and 1,000 red, white, and blue propellers cutting through the clouds. In the final months of the war, Rechlin lay silent. The hangars where Hans-Werner Lerche had once tested the world's deadliest machines were now shattered shells, their roofs torn open to the sky. Snow drifted through the broken rafters. The runways where genius once roared had become graveyards of twisted steel. Somewhere among the ruins sat the rusting remains of a P-47, not Beetle, but another, one of thousands that had thundered overhead and never come back. Lerche stood there once, after the surrender, staring at the carcass of the very idea he'd tried to warn his country about. Germany had built miracles. America had built machines. And in total war, machines beat miracles every time. He remembered the weight of the Thunderbolt's cockpit, the space, the strength, the logic of its design. He remembered how it never asked too much from its pilot, how it tolerated mistakes, how it stayed in the fight, even when battered and broken. That, he realized, was its genius. Not elegance, not speed, but forgiveness. Forgiveness for the human being inside it. It wasn't a plane built to glorify a nation, it was built to protect a life, and in that difference lay the outcome of the entire war. History would remember the Messerschmitt for its agility, the Focke-Wulf for its firepower, and the Me-262 for its speed. But the aircraft that truly defined victory was the one few admired for its looks, the big, loud, unglamorous P-47. It carried its pilots across continents, through flak, through storms, through everything man and nature could throw at it, and more often than not, it brought them home. Lerche's quiet report, filed and forgotten, had contained the war's simplest truth: practical beats perfect, reliable beats revolutionary. And the army that builds for the many will outlast the one that builds for the few. It wasn't poetry, it was prophecy. After the war, when interviewed by Allied historians, Lerche said something that sounded almost like confession. He said, "We were too proud to copy simplicity. We believed complexity was genius, but genius does not always survive." His words never made headlines, but they echoed in the design rooms of every nation that followed. The jet age began, but its foundations were laid by lessons written in oil and smoke above Europe, lessons the Thunderbolt had taught at 400 miles an hour. The P-47 would serve for decades, its descendants carrying the same DNA: redundancy, reliability, reach. Its legacy lived not in museums, but in the philosophy it proved that the true measure of a weapon is not how it performs in victory, but how it saves its user in defeat. Because in war, survival is victory. As for Hans-Werner Lerche, the man who saw too soon and spoke too softly, his life after the Reich was quiet. He lived long enough to see the jet era he helped usher in, long enough to know his warning had been right. He never glorified the past, never excused it. He simply kept flying, kept teaching, and kept believing that the purpose of engineering was to serve life, not ideology. And perhaps, somewhere deep inside, he carried a small, strange gratitude for the day he met Beetle, the captured Thunderbolt that taught him humility. Because in the end, that's the truth that outlived the Reich. A great machine isn't the one that demands greatness from its pilot, it's the one that forgives him. And when history chose between the beautiful and the practical, between the perfection of the few and the endurance of the many, it chose the sound of the Thunderbolt's engine roaring across the sky, singing the quiet victory of practicality over pride.